Okay, thank you very much. I would like to talk about evolution, the theory of evolution in relation to brain and behavior, or maybe I should say cognition. I will often use the word cognition instead of behavior. And of course, celebrating, as we did last year, the genius of Charles Darwin. As you all know, last year it was 200 years ago that he was born, and 150 years ago that he published his magnum opus. And so clearly he was a genius, but nevertheless there are problems with the application of the theory of evolution to brain and cognition. And I would like to discuss two of those problems, at least I see them as problems, with you today. The first one is that what I would call a medieval view of evolution, and the idea of Scala naturae is important there, and I will explain that in a moment. And the second issue I want to discuss is that evolution and mechanism, how things work, how behavior and cognition works, are often confounded. And I think that also creates certain problems, and I would like to discuss those as well. Now, back to Darwin then. What did the genius say about the evolution of cognition? He was quite clear about it in The Descent of Man. He said, and I quote, "There is no fundamental difference between man and the higher mammals, whatever they are, in their mental faculties." So it's actually quite a bold statement from Darwin here, that if you look at cognition, there's no real fundamental difference between us and the apes and the monkeys. Presumably that's what he means by higher mammals. Quite a bold statement, and actually if you sort of superficially look at the evolutionary tree, this is a very simple version of it, then you would say, well, it makes a lot of sense. If you look at if you compare us with apes, then it's about 5 to 6 million years ago that our common ancestor was walking around here. Whereas if you compare us with the modern birds, then it was considerably longer ago, about 300 million years ago, that the common ancestor of man and birds was probably crawling around, I expect. And so from an evolutionary point of view, we are much more closely related to apes than we are to birds. So it makes a lot of sense, as a lot of people have implied, that if you look for some kind of animal model of human cognition, then you should be looking at apes and not at birds, because they think more like we do than birds would do, possibly. And that idea has taken root in a lot of people's thinking, and in fact Darwin sort of alluded to this as well. He goes on to say in The Descent of Man that, and I quote again, "We must also admit that there is a much wider interval in mental power, cognitive power, between one of the lowest fishes," but he could have said birds, I'm sure, "and one of the higher apes than between an ape and man." So there is a huge gap, he says, between an ape and a fish or a bird, much bigger than between an ape and man. So he sees some kind of continuity here. And that has led, I think, to sort of a misunderstanding that people have taken that idea into account and come up with some kind of hierarchy in the animal world, the animal kingdom. Which relates to the idea of the Scala naturae, as I mentioned before, which is a sort of medieval idea that there is some kind of hierarchy in creation. We're talking about the Middle Ages here. And so there is some kind of a hierarchy. Scholars in the Middle Ages, they didn't talk about God in this respect. That was too high up. But there's a hierarchy where the angels are on top of the hierarchy, on top of the pyramid, closely followed by us, of course, and then probably the higher mammals after that. And then you go down to the level of the worms and the sponges. And that idea of some kind of hierarchy, of course not in that form, but that's similar ideas are still pervasive, I think, in the thinking of a lot of people, that there is some kind of hierarchy. If you look at animal models of cognition, you have to look higher in the hierarchy to come up with some kind of model for what we're thinking. And I think that creates problems. And one of those problems is anthropomorphism. So the idea, what is anthropomorphism? Well, it's sort of the opposite from what you see here in this photograph. This is a photograph of Konrad Lorenz and Nico Tinbergen, the founding fathers of behavioral biology, of ethology as it was called in those days. And here they are at some conference somewhere in Germany, I believe, maybe even here. And so the group photograph is going to be taken, and they were fooling around a bit, particularly Lorenz. Tinbergen doesn't seem to care much about it, and they're fleeing each other. So Lawrence is fleeing Tinbergen here as if they were two apes. And anthropomorphism is like the opposite of this, that is the attribution of human characteristics to animals. So animals have certain emotions, certain thoughts that we have. And that is sort of directly derived from the idea that there's some kind of hierarchy, that, you know, if you would attribute human emotions or thoughts to animals, you would probably look higher up in the hierarchy. And that isn't always the case, I think. Tinbergen himself, in his magnum opus, The Study of Instinct, 1952, I believe, he sort of warned against that kind of thinking. In the very first chapter of his book, where he sort of defines the field of ethology, as it was called in those days, behavioral biology, we would call it now, he defines it as the objective study of behavior. And he says, among other things, that, you know, animal emotions are not objectively observable, he says, in 1952. And therefore, he says that it's pointless to discuss them. You know, do they have emotions or not? Do they have certain thoughts like we have or not? Maybe they do, but maybe they don't. And it's pointless to talk about them because we can't observe them, he says. And even further, he goes, he says, it kills the assumption of those emotions. It kills our urge for continued research. So if you think you know what the animal is thinking, you know, if you say, well, it's obvious to me, you know, these animals, they're in love. The way they behave, just like we would behave when we were in love, they're in love. It's so obvious. I can see it. And if you think that, then, you know, there's no need for further research because I know what's going on here. So I don't have to research this in great detail because I know what's going on. It's so obvious. And that is a problem, according to Tinbergen, and I think he's right. And I give you one example, and probably the movie doesn't work now because the computer couldn't find it. But this refers to work done by Frans de Waal, who, like me, used to work in Utrecht. A long time ago, he did his PhD there with Jan van Hoof, my predecessor, and he did a lot of work in the Arnhem Zoo, where there's a large colony of chimpanzees, still is, and he observed those chimpanzees in great detail, and he saw a lot of fights between two chimpanzees going on all the time. And you know, I had a movie about that, but it doesn't play, it doesn't matter. And he observed all those fights, and he observed another very interesting behavior after a lot of those fights had occurred, that there was had been a fight between chimpanzee A and chimpanzee B, and then at some stage a third party would arrive, chimpanzee C, say, and would perform certain behaviors towards either A or B, interestingly. And these are some examples of that. This is a female chimpanzee that has just been in a fight, and there's her young, sort of performing certain behaviors, touching her in a certain way. These are two adult individuals. One of them has been in a fight and is embraced by the other one afterwards. And the third party hasn't been involved in the fight. And so de Waal observed this, and he said, you know, it's quite clear what's going on here. They are consoling each other. This is an example of consolation. And he, you know, unashamedly used that word in his publications a lot, and you know, established the idea that there's consolation going on. And he said somewhere that, you know, if closely related species to us behave in the way we behave in a similar situation, then we can assume that they think similarly. And so they would console each other, just like we would do. Now, and I think there's a problem here, because labeling the behavior like that indeed kills the urge for further research, as Tinbergen would say. Because further research has been done by one of the successors to Frans de Waal in our lab in Utrecht, Sonja Koski, who is now in Cambridge. And she did her PhD with Van Hoof and myself, and she also went to Arnhem Zoo and also observed the same chimpanzee colony, but in much more detail than Frans de Waal did, and maybe he couldn't do it in more detail. And she came up with quite different conclusions. She also saw that there was a lot of fighting going on between individuals all the time. She also saw this interesting behavior afterwards, but she concluded quite different things. That she said that the so-called consolation, she doesn't even use that word anymore in her publications. Yeah, only in the title of one of them, does consolation console? And the answer is basically no, because the consolation-like behavior doesn't lead to a reduction in stress, which can be measured in various ways. So it doesn't really do what it's supposed to be doing, that, you know, you're being consoled by it. Also, as I already indicated, both the victor and the loser of the fight are being consoled, which seems a bit odd. That, why would you console the victor? And finally, she concluded after a detailed analysis in her thesis that what has been called consolation, and which she called third-party affiliative behavior, is probably some kind of self-protection, if you can use another anthropomorphic word, perhaps. In any way, the chances by individual C of receiving aggression from either A or B after this kind of behavior are considerably less than if the individual wouldn't perform that kind of behavior. So the idea would be that if you perform that kind of consolation-like behavior, the chance of you yourself getting attacked by either of these guys are considerably smaller. So it's much more of a selfish, in inverted commas, kind of thing than some kind of empathy that you empathize with the loser of a fight. And it actually gets more interesting if you look at birds, which I do a lot, just like Tim. And this is the rook, which has been studied by a lot of people, but among those people from Cambridge again, Nikki Clayton and her group have looked at behavior of rooks. They also live in colonies, large social groups. Also, just like in the chimps, there's a lot of fighting going on between individuals in these colonies of rooks. And also, just like in the chimpanzees, often they observe that after a fight between A and B, lo and behold, a third party arrives, C, which performs certain behaviors towards either A or B, the victor or the loser. And of course, they don't have arms, so they can't embrace each other, but they do rub their beaks against each other in a kind of loving kind of way, as Nikki Clayton put it, colloquially, not in the paper. She called it French kissing. Maybe that says more about Nikki Clayton than about the rooks. But anyway, if Frans de Waal would have observed this kind of behavior, this kind of French kissing in his chimpanzees, he would say, well, I said it all along, they're consoling each other. It's so obvious what they're doing. They're consoling each other. So either you have to accept that, rooks also console each other, and they also have a feeling of empathy for each other, which is, fine by me, or you have to conclude that perhaps also in the rooks it's not so much consolation, but some kind of other behavior, some kind of other function for this behavior that you can assume. And of course, we don't know that at this moment. But I think it just goes to show that you have to be quite careful, not immediately put these labels on the behavior, because you don't quite know actually what it means at this stage. So caution is required. Otherwise, you kill the urge for further research. Now, I want to give you another example that sort of contradicts the idea of this hierarchy, this cognitive hierarchy and cognitive continuity between the apes and us. This is a monkey. This is not an ape. This is a capuchin monkey who is trying to perform a certain task, this so-called trap tube task, where there's a tube here and there's also a trap underneath the tube, and the monkey tries to get at some food here. So there's a morsel of food here that he can get at by pushing the food out of the tube. And as you can see here, if he pushes like this, the food will end up in this trap and he can't get at it. So he has to actually understand, in inverted commas, that he has to push from the other side of this tube to push the food out so it drops out and he can eat it, or she. And it turns out that they are hopeless at this. They get it wrong all the time. I mean, they also get it right sometimes, but half the time they get it wrong. And they don't seem to be able to get it, in inverted commas, how this works. And I used anthropomorphic terms here, but I'm sure you can forgive me for that. And in contrast to, again, a bird, a crow, a New Caledonian crow, studied by Alex Taylor and his collaborators in Auckland, where they have a very similar task. So again, they don't have arms, so they can't push things with it, but they can use their beaks and sticks to pull things out, and they pull things out of a trap tube here. So if they pull that way, then the food will drop out and they can eat it. If they pull the other way, then the food ends up in the trap and they can't eat it. Now, I hope this works. Yes, it seems to work. The name is Oboe. And there we are. So this might well be the first time that he has to do this, and he gets it right the first time. And they're very good at this, these crows. So they studied several individuals. They're very good at getting this right, almost always the first time. And as I said, these monkeys are hopeless at it, and chimpanzees, someone studied chimpanzees as well in a similar task. They're slightly better at it, but not half as good as the crows are. And it gets even better, an even smarter crow, again using anthropomorphic terms, where they show an example of meta-tool use, where they where this crow has to pick up a small stick, and with the small stick he has to prise that big stick out of that cage, and with the big stick he can finally get at the food. And more recently, Taylor et al. Having even found even more complex chains of, getting one stick and another stick, and etc., etc. They're extremely good at that. And in fact, the title of this paper in current biology is Spontaneous Meta-Tool Use. So they get it right the first time. They immediately grasp the idea, in inverted commas. Whereas again, monkeys are hopeless at this, and apes are only slightly better than the monkeys are. So there's a sort of counterintuitive result here that, if you believe in this kind of hierarchy and cognitive continuity, then it's a bit odd that, these birds that are so remotely related to us are actually quite good at it, whereas our closest relatives are pretty hopeless at it. Now, the final example of this counterintuitive kind of result, I think the sound doesn't work, but you should have supposed to be heard the sound of a chaffinch singing, a very common bird here in Europe, and a very beautiful song, and although it's simple. And the point of this slide is that young chaffinch males, they have to learn how to sing their songs. They're not born with their songs. So this is the son of that father, that's the son of that father, and as you can already see from these sonograms, so the frequency over time of these songs depicted here, that the sons clearly learn their songs from the fathers, their respective fathers. And there's a lot of research about that shows that. So they have to learn their songs very interestingly. Vocal imitation, vocal learning, and as some authors, particularly Hauser, Chomsky and Fitch, a few years ago in Science, have pointed out, that's actually quite interesting that they can do that. We, of course, do that too. So human infants start to speak first by imitating adults without realizing what they're saying probably, and we probably don't understand it either. But they just imitate us, they try to imitate us. They're very good at that. And songbirds are very good at that. Certain marine mammals are very good at that. Dolphins also imitate the sounds that they make from adult individuals. But apes and monkeys are not good at that. They just don't do that. They don't imitate the sounds that they make from adult individuals, as far as we can tell, as far as been researched. So again, there's a very interesting and counterintuitive discrepancy here. There doesn't seem to be some kind of cognitive continuity continuum here, that our closest relatives do these things just like we do, but very remotely related species do it sort of the way we do. So again, no evidence really for some kind of hierarchy here. Now, I'm particularly interested in birdsong. We work on birdsong a lot, and if you look at it in more detail, as we have done, this is a young chaffinch male. Usually it's the males that sing and not the females, but we will come back to that later. And as you can see here in the sonograms, that this is the adult song, and this is very early song, and this is sort of very reminiscent, people have noticed, even Darwin noticed that, of babbling in human infants. So when human infants start to talk, they say, da da dee dee, and they don't really speak properly, and it takes a lot of rehearsing to be able to say proper words and make proper sentences. And it's a bit like that in these songbirds. They also go through some kind of babbling stage, which we call subsong, before they reach the adult stage. And in fact, there are lots of similarities, parallels between the way that songbirds learn how to sing and human infants learn how to speak. And there's a whole list of them. I've just put two here. One is this babbling stage or subsong stage, which is very, very similar indeed. The other one is that in both cases there is a sensitive period early in development, very clearly established in songbirds and lots of species. And also in ourselves, those among us who are a bit older will realize that the older we get, the more difficult it is for us to learn new language with new sounds and new words. And so myself, I'm struggling very much to learn Hungarian, because my wife is Hungarian, but my daughter here, she has no problems learning Hungarian and Dutch and English at the same time, very quickly, amazingly. And so she's in the middle of her sensitive period, and she can do these things that I can't do anymore. So that's a very interesting similarity. And also, more recently, people have noticed, and we reviewed that actually this week in the Nature Review, so you can read all about it, that there are also very interesting neural, and you knew that for a while, of course, we reviewed them now, neural and genetic parallels. So the brains of songbirds, believe it or not, are actually quite similarly organized in this respect, in the relating to vocal learning and vocal memory compared to human brains. And also there are genetic parallels, and you will have heard perhaps about the FOXP2 gene. I won't have time now to go into that. You can read all about it. So all these examples that I mentioned so far, so the crows doing their thing and the songbirds doing their thing, begs the question that instead of this idea of some kind of hierarchy, sort of common descent being very important, as Darwin emphasized in those quotes that I gave you, that the more closely related these species are, the more similar they will be, cognitively speaking, doesn't always apply, apparently. So it looks to be the case that if you look, for instance, at vocal learning, vocal imitation, that these guys are much more similar than we are compared to monkeys and apes. So the idea of evolutionary convergence is perhaps much more important here, that remotely related, distantly related species have perhaps encountered similar problems in the course of evolution for which they have come up with similar solutions to those problems. So the problem of vocal learning, how do I learn how to sing or to speak? These guys have come up with something quite similar to us, also in terms of the brain, the organization of the brain. And they haven't done that. So apparently, they haven't encountered that kind of problem. They didn't need to learn their vocalizations. Perhaps, that's only speculative, of course. But in this case, convergence is very important. And so you can ask the question, you always have to ask the question, I think, if you look at these things, that are we dealing here with some kind of common descent phenomenon or not? And a lot of people forget to ask that question, I think. And we concluded in that paper that I just mentioned, which is called Twitter Evolution, for obvious reasons, that both occur in the case of vocal learning and the neural mechanisms thereof. That on the one hand, there is clearly common descent, that there are homologies, and the exact details have to be researched still, but there are certain clearly homologies if you look at the brains of birds and of mammals. So also the monkeys and the apes, they also have certain regions in the brain that are involved in vocal production, also involved in auditory learning, and all organized in a very similar way. But on the other hand, there's also convergence. So what you do with those brains, whether you do vocal learning with them or not, is quite different between apes and us and birds. And so there is clearly, in that case, there is convergence going on. So analogous behavioral and cognitive solutions to certain problems. So both can be the case. And it's not always obvious which one is important here. So that led, actually, we published an essay about these issues last year in a popular journal where they came up with a cartoon sort of illustrating this, that the monkey or the ape here has great trouble doing anything here, whereas the parrot even gives a specific kind of apple, and people have pointed out to me, he's actually got it wrong. This is not a Golden Delicious. This is a Granny Smith. But to which I would say, they're not perfect, but they're pretty smart nevertheless. So this is a bit of a joke, of course. And moving on then to the second main issue that I want to discuss. So we discussed this Scala naturae business and concluded that we have to be very cautious and don't try to kill further research. And the other problem, I think, is possibly an even bigger problem. That is that a lot of people tend to confound evolution and mechanism. And what do I mean by that? Well, we have to go back again to our friend and my compatriot, Nico Tinbergen, who, together with, of course, with Lawrence, got the Nobel Prize for inventing ethology. He wrote a paper, a very nice paper, in 1963 on the occasion of Lawrence's 60th birthday, and where he said, well, what is this field of ours, ethology, behavioral biology, we would call it now? What is it all about? What are the big questions in our field? And I think you can extend those to biology in general. And he said, there are four main questions in my view, he said, and I think he was very good, very accurate there. The first question, of course, is evolution. How has behavior evolved? How can we reconstruct the history of certain behaviors? What happened to get to this stage? The other question is about function, as we would call it now. He called it survival value. What is this behavior for? I won't go into that now. The other one is the development of behavior, which he thought was very important, which people sort of ignored until that stage, mostly in behavioral terms. He called it ontogeny, very important factor, of course. And also, as we heard yesterday too, and finally, the question of mechanism, as I would call it. He called it causation. What causes this behavior? What is the machinery involved, and what are the stimuli involved in this kind of behavior? What is the machinery of it? And my point is that you have to identify these four questions, and you have to make sure for yourself which is the question that I'm looking at now in this particular experiment. What do I want to know? Do I want to know the history of this behavior? Do I want to know its function? Or do I want to know its mechanism? And you should be careful to not confuse these questions. You shouldn't try to answer a sort of a mechanistic question with an evolutionary theory. And that's what people have done, though. And I will briefly discuss a few examples of that. So the idea of evolutionary and functional considerations as explanations for the mechanisms of brain and cognition or behavior in animals. There are two examples of that. One is called cognitive ecology, and the other one is called neuroecology. And I'll very briefly give you a definition of that. Sue Healy and Victoria Braithwaite have written a very nice paper in Tree some years ago, 10 years ago already. And they define it as follows: work that attempts to integrate functional explanations of behavior, such as those provided by behavioral ecology, with an understanding of the underlying psychological and neural mechanisms. So they try to integrate these two. That if you want to, they want to say something about the mechanism, I think, by appealing to function and evolution. And you can go to the neural level more specifically, and we've coined a phrase which actually has been coined before, apparently, but it's taken off quite well, I think, we being Ewan McPhail and myself in a paper in Ticks some years ago, where we define neuroecology sort of very loosely as the study of the neural mechanisms of behavior guided by functional and evolutionary principles. So we're a bit more cautious. We give some credit to people that they're trying to somehow say something about the mechanisms, the neural mechanisms in this case, by appealing to evolutionary and functional theory. And I think that can lead to certain problems. And one problem is, I will illustrate, is about the difference between the sexes, because that's of course what we are talking about here in this conference. This is a very complicated picture, but this is a very simplified picture of a bird brain, the brain of a bird, of a songbird, of a zebrafinch in this case. And again, we reviewed that in another popular journal where we identified basically two main sets of brain nuclei that are involved in birdsong. And this ugly greenish nuclei are involved in somehow in the perception of song and in the memory of song. And we explain all about that in the paper. I won't go into that now. And now I'm concentrating on these sort of beige regions here that together are called the song system, has been called like that for donkey's years by people like Nottebohm and others in the States that have researched this in great detail. And the song system was supposed to be crucial for song, not only for the singing itself, but also for song learning. And we've shown, I think, quite convincingly that that's not quite the case, but that's not the point now. So there is a song system, and it does something with song. And but the question is what? And I think the research until quite recently has been very neuroecological in the sense that people have tried to use evolutionary and functional ideas to come up with something about mechanisms. The way these brains work, these bird brains work, has something to do with the way the system has evolved and what they are for. And there are various ways people have done that. People have looked at songbird brains versus non-songbird brains. So if you look at a gull or a dove or something, they don't have to learn their songs. Their brains are also quite different. They don't have this song system at all. Also very intriguingly, Nottebohm again has looked at the brains of canaries, and in particular where they're actually, these song system nuclei, they're actually bigger in the spring when there's a lot of song learning going on, a lot of singing going on, courtship singing, and then in the autumn, or the fall, if you like. I won't talk about that now. I will concentrate on sex differences, because also interestingly, male brains in these songbirds are different from female brains. So if you look at that song system that I just identified, it's actually bigger in males than in females. And as I already implied earlier on, that in a lot of species of songbird, it's the males that sing and the females don't sing. They have certain calls, but they don't have these complex songs. So the idea took root that when this was discovered by Arnold and Nottebohm in the 70s, I believe, that perhaps this enormous difference that these nuclei are much bigger in males than in females, and it's the males that sing and it's the males that learn these complex songs, perhaps that has something to do with each other. So these functional differences, as it were, have something to do perhaps with the mechanisms, in the sense that if you learn these complex songs all the time, you need a bigger brain for it, basically. You need specialized regions in the brain that are bigger to learn these songs. That was the idea ventilated at the time, until more recently when Manfred Gahr at Zeewiesen, I think he wasn't at Zeewiesen at the time, I think, but never mind. He looked at that in more detail. So this is just summarizing what I just said, that song system nuclei are usually larger in males than in females who do not sing. And he looked at another species, the African duetting bush shrike. And this is very sort of romantic bird, because both the males and the females sing. And they said they duet, they sing to each other. So, as I said, very romantic. But interestingly, from our point of view, let's forget about the anthropomorphism now. From our point of view, is that they both sing very similarly. They both learn their songs from each other often. They both have a very similar repertoire of different songs, and they both sing a lot at about equal rates. So there's a complete sexual equality here in terms of this behavior, that you can't distinguish between males and females on that basis. And nevertheless, if you look at their brains, which Manfred has done with his colleagues, published in Journal of Neuroscience, and had quite a lot of difficulty getting this published, because people couldn't believe it. Because what they found was, whatever technique they used lots of different staining techniques. So on the left here are the male nuclei of the song system, on the right are the female ones. And again, you can see that they are significantly bigger in the male than in the female in these species, where they are as far as song is concerned, they're completely identical, males and females. And nevertheless, they have this enormous difference in the brain. So there's no easy match here between the functional differences because there aren't any, and the neural differences here. So I think one has to be very cautious here that it's an interesting idea that these differences in the brain have something to do with learning abilities, but apparently it's not the case, and people are still trying to find out what these differences are for, if at all. So I think at the most, what you can say about these evolutionary and functional considerations is that it can provide you with clues. And some people, maybe behavioral ecologists, said, that's a bit sort of, not a good term to use, clues. We should talk about hypotheses. They can generate hypotheses. Okay, fair enough. But I thought I'd keep it in looking for clues because, for obvious reasons. So what I would want to say is that evolutionary or functional considerations they cannot explain the mechanisms, as you could see from these examples, that it apparently doesn't work that way. They can give you clues for the study of these mechanisms. It could well have been the case that these differences that you observe in the brain have something to do, they have evolved such that they can accommodate these learning differences. But as we could see, it doesn't work that way. And there are other examples that I couldn't go into now that equally don't work. And so they can be misleading, these clues. So the hypotheses are not confirmed, they are actually have to be rejected. So they are but clues, and they are not explanations. And I think we have to keep that in mind, very much so, and a lot of people don't do that. Now finally, I want to move on to evolutionary psychology, has been mentioned already today. And the idea, very briefly, is that evolutionary considerations as explanations for human cognition, I think, is what's going on here. And basically the idea is by a certain branch of evolutionary psychology, often spelled with capitals. The Santa-Barbarian root of it is that the mind/brain has evolved as a result of selection pressures basically in the Stone Age, in the Pleistocene. Why particularly the Stone Age, that's another matter altogether. You can debate that. But that is what some of these people say. So some of these people are quite explicit that, that we've been barking up the wrong tree in psychology for a long time, that, if you want to understand the way we think, the way our brain works, you have to look at evolution, they say. There's no other way of understanding the way we think. And I don't really agree with that. This has led to all kinds of sort of just so stories, coffee table books such as these, by the Barashes, and often the couples working on these fields. I don't know why. Must be some kind of evolutionary explanation for that. But and this is Madame Bovary's ovaries. I don't know when you can read it from the back. And basically, this is some kind of evolutionary psychological interpretation of fictional characters' behavior. And Madame Bovary, she was an adulteress because something happened in the Stone Age that made her do this kind of thing. And you can laugh about that, and I do. And there are slightly more serious books, always with big titles about sex and passion and love. And for instance, this is a book by David Buss, a very prominent evolutionary psychologist, who has written a lot about and researched a lot about jealousy in humans, and I just want to give you one example of that. So if you write serious books, if you want EP, evolutionary psychology, to be serious science, then you can expect serious discussions, because that's what science is all about. So one of those critics is David Buller, who's written a book, very fine book, I think, published some years ago, where he goes into great detail. And that's the only disadvantage of the book. It's quite thick, because he goes into great detail, sort of rejecting most of the evidence that is provided by evolutionary psychologists. And one of the examples that he discusses, this is in a more popular paper in Scientific American, I believe, where he goes into the example of jealousy. So this is some kind of questionnaire that people were asked. I don't know who did this research, doesn't really matter, where people were asked certain questions. So here's the questionnaire for you, and people were asked, I think these were students, that imagine you're in a relationship, or perhaps you are in a relationship. What would you find worse if your partner was being a bit naughty with someone else in a sexual way, was having sex with someone else, or your partner was actually in love with someone else? So what would you find worse? And then, interestingly, these researchers found that there are differences between the sexes, again, in the way they respond to this question. So males, on the whole, find it much more upsetting if their partner has a sexual infidelity, as it's called here, than an emotional one. Whereas females are the other way around. They find it much more upsetting if their partner has an emotional relationship with someone else. And of course, that ties in very, very nicely with the sort of Bateman's principle that males want to inseminate as many females as they can, whereas females want to keep the males with them to take care of the young, all that kind of thing. I mean, I'm not a behavioral ecologist, but you know all these things. And so it would fit the bill that males would respond more in that way than females. But if you look a bit further, which is what Buller has done in his book, if you, for instance, look at the Netherlands, where I'm from, the males are slightly less fussy. It's about 50-50. Half of them find the sexual relationship of their partner upsetting. The other half finds the emotional one more upsetting. And if you move a bit closer to where we are now, in Germany, the German males are actually very much like the American females, that they find it much more upsetting if their partner has some kind of emotional affair rather than having an off with someone else. So, as you can see from this simple example, is that there are enormous cultural differences. So, just between countries, the males and the females are, these differences are bigger than between males and females on the whole. So Buller is saying, and I think quite rightly so, and of course he has lots of other examples that I can't go into now, that if you look at the cultural dimension here, the cultural factor seems to be much more important here than the sort of evolutionary factor. And so, that you have to take that into account, and that's often neglected, I think. And of course, as we heard already this morning, that Bateman's principles don't often work the way we thought they would work. So we've heard lots of examples already, and there's a very fine paper that Frank alluded to by Julian Brown et al., published, I think, last year in Tree, where they go into this in great detail, and also about the implications for evolutionary psychology. So I won't dwell on that now. Now, why do I think, and OS2, why do I think that EP doesn't work? And maybe I'm overstating the case, but first of all, there are no cognitive or neural fossils to speak of. So often we have to come up with some kind of just so story. Well, I can imagine that it happened like that in the Stone Age. There's not much evidence to go by. As I just indicated, apart from biological evolution, there's also cultural evolution. We think, well, at least I hope so, we think quite differently from our predecessors in medieval times, or the old Greeks or something like that, let alone the Stone Age. So I would suggest that we have evolved culturally very rapidly, in fact, in the last centuries. And also, which I find a very important point, is that, as I try to illustrate with the whole Tinbergen scheme, is that evolution is not about mechanisms. I think the theory of evolution is a tool for us to reconstruct the history of certain traits. How did these traits come about? And it's not about how these things work. What are the mechanisms of how does the brain work? It can provide you with clues or hypotheses, but it can't explain it. So you have to, if you want to know about how our mind works, you have to use psychological techniques. If you want to know about how our brain works, you have to do neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, I think. So to conclude then, brain and behavior and cognition have evolved, obviously. Everything that there is now has evolved. But it's not always clear whether we are dealing with common descent, as people often imply, people like Duval, or convergence. And as I've illustrated in the case of Birdsong, both can be at work, and it's not easy to tease them apart. And finally, evolution is one of the four main questions that Tinbergen formulated. So there's also development, function, and mechanisms. And evolution is not about mechanisms. Evolution is about evolution. So on that note, I'd like to thank you for your attention and just show you who actually has collaborated with me and discussed these things with me. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Johan. We have time for 2 questions. Yes? Can you stand up and introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Claude Anthony from EMBL. I have a question about bird songs and the learning. In bird songs and the dialect exist, which are prevailing in some geographical areas. And as bird songs are very important, species-specific recognition, when the young birds learn from the father, as you mentioned, could young birds learn a dialect if you exchange the father in a special environment?
You say dialects, yes?
Yeah, about dialects, yeah. And how is this inherited? Or I wonder if there's not epigenetics, for instance, that could transmit this pattern to the progeny?
Well, that's a very interesting question. So basically, it's a cultural kind of inheritance. So they learn from their father often, or other individuals. And indeed, they do have dialects. They have accents. So a song sparrow from New York would obviously have a different accent than one from New Jersey or something, or California. And so they learn that from their father. And there's been recent research by Chernikowski and Olga Feher from New York. How funny! And they looked into what they call a song culture. That if you raise zebra finches with adults that have been isolated themselves, they have a very weird isolate song. They copy that isolate song, so they also have a weird song that they've learned. So they've learned a very weird New York accent, as it were. But nevertheless, after certain generations, the sort of song sort of moves back to the sort of wild type form. So there is some kind of wild type song coming back into it. So there are sort of certain constraints on that, apparently. The details of that have to be worked out, but yeah, it's an interesting point.
Yeah, my area is the evolution of language.
Okay.
So it is one of the areas that is criticized from the same kind of thing that you're talking about with evolutionary psychology. I agree with what you said, and it's a common misunderstanding about the confusion between mechanism and function. And Aristotle, I think, made that very clear a long time ago. He said, you know, a house is there not only because one stone has been placed on another, but because people want to live in it. So there's a functional and a mechanistic thing. Yes. But you were talking about, if I understand correctly, the first half of your talk about, you know, this convergent evolution, parrots having similar properties to human speech. I mean, I think you conflated language with speech there a bit. But you're talking about relatedness when you're talking about hierarchy. I think that's what you were really talking about, that relatedness shouldn't be the only cue to... but you're citing particular examples to try and disprove a trend. I think it's still the best place to look is in closely related species, even if there are exceptions that can be explained by convergent evolution. And you use the same kind of reasoning with this criticism of evolutionary psychology in this example where the Netherlands and Germany were exceptions to a trend. I mean, the trend is there and it needs to be explained. So,
the trend is there, but you know we don't know what caused that. What are the causal factors?
You said that culture is more important.
But also within a country, you know, cultural factors could have played a big role too. I don't know that. I don't know which explanation is correct here. I mean, I don't know anything about this research, but it has to be taken into account. And to come back to the beginning of your question, if I can put it that way, that you know, evolution of language. I'm not saying that you know that common descent is not important. What I was saying was that it is important, but convergence can also be very important, and that they are intertwined in the case of vocal imitation, the evolution of vocal imitation. And you know, if you're interested in language, so am I. And you know, if you look at in the old days, people immediately looked at primates for sort of animal models for speech or language evolution. I use the word speech, not language, by the way. But and you know, and those attempts have failed. I think basically. I mean, the average linguist would say, well, yeah, what these chimps are doing is not. I wouldn't call that language. And of course, some people have gone perhaps a bit too far the other way. People like Margoliouth in Nature a few years ago, they published a paper where apparently these songbirds, these starlings, have certain cognitive capacities that they can identify recursion in starling songs, starling speech, and yeah, maybe that's and linguists have attacked that too. That yeah, that's nonsense. That has nothing to do with recursion. So you can go the other way. Too far the other way as well, but you know there are some people like Okanoya, my co-author, has gone a long way to identify structure in birdsong that is actually not completely unlike the structure that we have in speech. And you know, and the difference is that you know they don't have words and they don't have semantics probably, as far as we know. Although some people have debated that as well. So you could see it as some kind of primitive version of syntax in these birds, but not more than that. Perhaps.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to stop and go for lunch, and you can keep your question for the general discussion this afternoon, because we certainly go back. And I want to thank all the speakers for this morning for that very good scientific talk.